In 2015, El Salvador earned an infamous title with a staggering murder rate of 103 homicides per 100,000 people, making it the world's most dangerous country. Dubbed the murder capital of the world by American media, the nation grappled with rampant violence. Fast forward to 2019, when a new president, Nayib Bukele, took office with a bold promise to bring the notorious gangs terrorizing the country to heel. His approach, however, has sparked heated debates on the global stage. When Bukele assumed power in June 2019, El Salvador's homicide rate was still alarmingly high at 35.8 per 100,000 people. Yet by 2023, a remarkable transformation had occurred. The homicide rate had plummeted to 2.4 per 100,000, lower than that of the United States and second only to Canada in the Western Hemisphere. Reflecting this newfound safety, fewer Salvadorans were being caught crossing the US southern border, and many nationals were even choosing to return home. But how could such a dramatic shift happen almost overnight? On March 25, 2022, 87 people were murdered in El Salvador in retaliation for the government seizing 2 bus routes in the capital, a move that disrupted the revenue of the infamous MS-13 gang. This gruesome act was the tipping point. Bukele's government responded with an unprecedented strategy that obliterated the gang's operations and changed the nation's trajectory forever. What was this decisive action? And why do some view Bukele's methods as controversial enough to label him a potential dictator? Join us as we delve into the complexities behind El Salvador's swift turnaround. In February 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador made a desperate plea to then US President Jimmy Carter, urging him to halt military aid to the Salvadoran regime. Romero's open letter highlighted the grim reality: US funds were bolstering the forces oppressing the Salvadoran people. At the time, the Salvadoran regime, heavily influenced and equipped by foreign powers, exercised brutal control over the nation. Seeking peace for his people, Romero's courageous appeal became a fatal act. Just 3 weeks later, he was assassinated, a martyr for a cause that would take nearly 4 decades to achieve under President Nayib Bukele, whose controversial anti-violence policies finally brought the elusive peace Romero had dreamed of. Romero's death marked the beginning of a tumultuous period for El Salvador. On March 31, 1980, approximately 250,000 Salvadorans gathered for Romero's funeral. The solemn occasion turned into a massacre when government-sponsored snipers opened fire on the crowd, killing 42 people and wounding over 200. This harrowing event was just a precursor to even more devastating conflicts. Later that year, on December 2, 1980, the brutality continued when 5 members of the Salvadoran National Guard kidnapped 4 American female missionaries. The hapless victims were driven to a remote location where they were beaten, raped, and murdered. The next morning, the discovery of their bodies ignited international outrage and prompted President Jimmy Carter to temporarily cut off US aid to El Salvador. This move inadvertently set the stage for the rise of the paramilitary group, the Farabundo Mart National Liberation Front, the FMLN. The FMLN fought back with equal ferocity, retaliating against every military incursion by the Salvadoran government. As the FMLN appeared on the brink of reclaiming the nation, a significant political shift occurred. The election of US President Ronald Reagan brought renewed support for the Salvadoran armed forces. The Reagan administration re-established its alliance, substantially increasing financial aid with a $10 million package, half of which was earmarked for weapons, ammunition, grenades, and helicopters. This controversial move bewildered many world leaders. Further complicating the conflict, international allies such as Chile's military government and Argentina's military dictatorship provided extensive training and tactical support to the Salvadoran armed forces under Operation Charlie. And now, what I'm about to share ties everything we've discussed together. By 1989, the conflict between the Farabundo Mart National Liberation Front, FMLN, and the Salvadoran armed forces had reached a deadlock. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and global changes began to strip away the foreign support both parties had relied upon. The collapse of the Soviet Union signaled a significant loss for the FMLN, while the end of the Cold War diminished the US interest in supporting the controversial Salvadoran counterinsurgency. This geopolitical shift, combined with the aftermath of widespread violence, compelled the US to advocate for a peace settlement. During this period, approximately 88,000 soldiers and civilians in El Salvador had lost their lives due to the conflict. Nearly a quarter of the population fled, with many seeking refuge in the United States, predominantly in Los Angeles and other parts of California. But even as the Salvadoran Civil War concluded, the violence persisted in a different form. In the chaotic landscape of post-war Los Angeles, many displaced Salvadorans, now residing in marginalized communities, became entangled in gang violence. This situation was exacerbated by the US war on drugs and stringent anti-immigration policies, culminating in the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. This law mandated the deportation of immigrants, documented or undocumented, with criminal records, once they completed their jail sentences. This twist in the tale reveals an unsettling reality. The gang members involved were not seasoned criminals, but rather young Salvadoran teenagers. The war had displaced numerous families, leaving countless children to fend for themselves. Feeling abandoned and living in a society where violence was normalized, these youths found solace and a semblance of security in gangs. Notably, the gangs provided a sense of belonging, albeit at the cost of their freedom. Entities like the 18th Street Gang and MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, capitalized on these vulnerabilities. The 18th Street Gang, also known as Barrio 18 or simply 18, evolved into one of the largest transnational criminal organizations, with 30,000 to 50,000 members spread across the US, Mexico, and Central America. Aligned with the Mexican Mafia, a US-based syndicate, some factions of the 18th Street Gang grew sophisticated and organized in their operations. Members often identified themselves by wearing apparel featuring the number 18 or branding of sports teams like the Duke Blue Devils or LA Clippers. Their violent activities extended to Guatemala City, where bus drivers frequently face robbery, extortion, and, in several tragic instances, murder. One bus driver, who refused to pay the gang, faced the brutal retaliation of having his son killed. Where the lethal menace of the 18th Street Gang ends, the terror of MS-13 begins. Known for their ruthlessness, MS-13 has become synonymous with extreme violence, both within and beyond the borders of El Salvador. It's within this context of enduring brutality and shifting allegiances that Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele's controversial anti-violence measures emerge, promising to transform El Salvador's violent past into a more peaceful future. When it comes to gang violence in El Salvador, MS-13 stands out with a particularly fierce reputation. Known as Mara Salvatrucha 13, MS-13 is more than just a name. It represents a legacy of brutality inherited from the Civil War. Members, often impoverished young men and teenagers estranged from their families, survive by engaging in minor drug dealings, theft, and extortions. Disturbingly, El Salvador ranks third in the world for femicides, with a staggering 2016 statistic showing that 1 in 5,000 Salvadoran women were killed, and a mere 5% of these cases resulted in convictions. Many MS-13 members wear their affiliations literally on their faces, with elaborate tattoos, including the words Mara Salvatrucha, devil horns, and the name of their clique. However, by the early 2000s, they began to move away from facial tattoos to avoid detection while committing crimes. Just like American gangs, MS-13 members use hand signs for identification and communication, one of the most common being the devil's head, which forms an M when flipped upside down, a symbol that might also be familiar to heavy metal fans. MS-13's extreme cruelty has attracted the attention of other notorious criminal organizations. Some members were even recruited by the Sinaloa cartel to battle Los Zetas in the Mexican drug war. Their diverse and violent activities have not only drawn the attention of local law enforcement, but also caught the eye of federal agencies. The FBI and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) initiated wide-scale raids, arresting hundreds of known and suspected gang members across the U.S. Yet these crackdowns didn't weaken MS-13. They seemed only to strengthen the resolve of its members. In 2004, the FBI established the MS-13 National Gang Task Force to enhance collaboration among local and state agencies to dismantle the gang. Initially, their primary strategy involved deporting gang members to their home countries, rather than incarcerating them in the US when this approach failed. The FBI partnered with law enforcement in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, and even opened offices in these regions to directly confront the gang. This international cooperation resulted in the arrest and prosecution of over 6,000 members across the US and Central America. Yet MS-13's violence continued unabated. Enter Nayib Bukele. His dramatic crackdown on gang violence included transferring about 2,000 inmates, heads shaved, to what's been dubbed the country's new mega-prison. His approach built upon strategies of previous Salvadoran presidents, most notably Antonio Soca, who in 2004 implemented a policy called Super Mano Dura. This policy granted the Salvadoran military extensive powers to patrol gang-controlled areas, conduct random searches, and arrest individuals based on appearance alone. Approximately 4,000 gang members were arrested under this policy, leading to overcrowded prisons, and, by 2012, a truce negotiated between MS-13 and the government. The truce received international criticism, as many viewed it as the government caving into gang demands. Yet, it had a notable impact. In early 2012, the murder rate in El Salvador was averaging 16 killings per day. By late March, that number had dropped to fewer than 5 per day, and on April 14, 2012, the country saw a rare day with no killings. The stats were telling. January 2012 had recorded around 411 killings, but by March, the number was down to 188, a near 50% reduction. Despite its initial success, the truce eventually fell apart, and the violence returned with a vengeance. By 2015, El Salvador had around 60,000 gang members, and 70% of businesses were being extorted, leading to estimated annual losses of $1 billion. To grasp how Bukele managed to halt this centuries-old cycle of violence, we must first understand his background. Born on July 24, 1981, Nayib Bukele grew up as a privileged outsider in El Salvador. His father, a Muslim businessman of Palestinian descent, opened the country's first McDonald's franchise, ran a textile company, helped build 4 mosques, and owned a PR firm. Polygamously married with 6 wives, Bukele's father provided an affluent upbringing for his children, including Nayib, who had 3 brothers and 7 half-siblings. Nayib attended a private bilingual school and later dropped out of college to manage a nightclub in downtown San Salvador. Bukele's political journey began when he took over his family's PR firm, whose key client was the FMLN, the same organization that had fought against the Salvadoran armed forces during the Civil War. The presidency and the National Assembly were controlled by the right-wing AREANA party, founded in the early 1980s by a member of a death squad. The ARENA party primarily catered to the business elite, but also included ex-military men and religious conservatives. This complex political landscape shaped Bukele's outlook and future strategies. In 2015, Bukele entered politics by running for mayor of San Salvador, the nation's capital, under the FMLN banner. His charismatic and innovative approach quickly garnered public support. During his tenure, he focused on modernizing the city's infrastructure and implementing social programs aimed at reducing poverty and violence. His efforts paid off, and in 2019, he won the presidential election, positioning himself as a reformist outsider, challenging the status quo. As president, Bukele faced the monumental task of addressing the gang violence that had plagued El Salvador for decades. His administration adopted a multifaceted approach that built on prior strategies, but with much more intensity. In addition to mass incarcerations and a significant increase in police and military presence in gang-dominated areas, Bukele introduced a series of social programs designed to tackle the root causes of gang involvement, such as poverty and lack of education. One of his most controversial moves was the construction of the country's mega-prison. This facility, built with state-of-the-art security technology, became infamous for its harsh conditions. Thousands of gang members were transferred there in a bid to break their organizational structures. The government released images of inmates with their heads shaved and tightly packed into cells, which drew both praise and condemnation. Critics argued that these measures violated human rights and failed to address the underlying issues, while supporters hailed them as necessary actions to restore order. Bukele's administration also established international collaborations to combat gang violence. By working closely with agencies such as the FBI and aligning with neighboring countries like Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala, El Salvador was able to put pressure on gangs from multiple fronts. These partnerships led to significant arrests and disrupted operations, placing MS-13 and other gangs on the defensive. Despite these efforts, the fight against gang violence is far from over. The structural issues that gave rise to these gangs persist, including economic inequality, political corruption, and social exclusion. Bukele's approach has succeeded in reducing crime rates, but whether these reductions will be sustainable in the long term remains to be seen. Moreover, Bukele's leadership style has stirred controversy. His aggressive tactics and authoritative demeanor have led some to label him a populist authoritarian. Concerns have been raised about the potential erosion of democratic institutions and the balance of power in El Salvador. This debate over Bukele's methods highlights a larger conversation about the cost of security and stability in a nation that has long been embroiled in violence. In the end, Bukele's legacy will likely be defined by his bold and sometimes polarizing efforts to rewrite El Salvador's narrative. His tenure is a critical chapter in the country's ongoing struggle for peace and prosperity. Whether his policies will create lasting change or simply a temporary respite from violence will shape El Salvador's path for years to come. In 2009, a series of corruption scandals rocked the ARENA party, paving the way for the FMLN to seize power in El Salvador. For the next decade, the FMLN held a firm grip on the political landscape. Nayib Bukele, initially involved with the FMLN through business connections, launched a self-funded campaign to become the mayor of Nuevo Cuscatel N, a municipality in El Salvador. He won the election and made such a significant impact that the FMLN encouraged him to run for mayor of San Salvador. Bukele's political rise, however, came with its challenges. The FMLN, mired in its shady past, attempted to tarnish his future prospects. As a result, Bukele decided to sever ties with the party and founded a new one, leading him to the presidency. On June 1, 2019, Nayib Bukele was elected as the 43rd RD president of El Salvador, becoming the youngest head of state in Latin America and embodying a promise of a new national beginning. Bukele's first steps to eradicate gang violence involved negotiating a peace treaty. Local newspaper El Faro reported on the negotiations, but soon after, Bukele announced an investigation into the newspaper for money laundering. This move raised eyebrows and was the beginning of an ongoing conflict between Bukele and the press. He has since been relentless in his attacks on El Faro, with many journalists facing threats, forcing some into exile. Others adopted the practice of leaving the country after publishing stories and returning only after the threats had subsided. Despite its international following, domestically, Bukele's campaign against El Faro has significantly tarnished its credibility. In a controversial move, the Salvadoran National Assembly passed a law that restricted news outlets from reporting on gang activities. Journalists faced up to 10 years in prison if they reproduced or transmitted information from gang sources or anything that might incite public panic. Bukele enacted these laws as part of his larger strategy to suppress gang violence. In March 2022, EMS 13 marked its position through a horrendous act of violence, slaughtering 87 people in just 3 days. This massacre targeted ordinary citizens with no connections to crime, aiming to send a clear message to Bukele, who had vowed to reduce crime drastically and improve El Salvador's international image. Bukele's response was swift and severe. He declared a state of emergency, implementing new policies that allowed gang populations to mix in prison, a measure previously avoided to reduce prison violence. He orchestrated large-scale operations where prisoners were stripped, arranged in tightly packed rows, and photographed to send a warning to other gang members. Under the guise of democracy, Bukele introduced extreme legal measures that deprived Salvadorans of basic constitutional rights. The state of emergency included provisions that allowed arrests without warrants, denied detainees the right to a lawyer, and authorized the government to intercept private communications. Security forces aggressively pursued gang members and suspected associates without warrants, significantly speeding up the arrest process compared to previous administrations. The crackdown's impact was immediate. In the first few months, 33,000 arrests were recorded. Suspension of constitutional rights to legal defense meant authorities could detain individuals indefinitely on vague charges without supporting evidence. Detainees were often held without a court hearing within 72 hours of arrest, and communication with lawyers or civil society organizations was frequently denied. Arrests were based on unverified intelligence and rumors, sometimes sourced from social media profiles. Furthermore, Bukele's administration enacted laws to ensure gang members remained incarcerated for longer periods. Jail sentences for gang affiliation were increased, and house arrest for gang-associated individuals was no longer an option. So, how effective was this crackdown? According to multiple sources, neighborhoods in El Salvador previously plagued by gangs saw significant reductions in gang presence. Residents reported seeing fewer gang members, and those who did return held far less power than before the state of emergency. Extortion, a common gang activity, also saw a significant decline. A bus company owner, who used to pay around $6,000 in monthly extortion fees to two main gang factions, stopped paying immediately after the crackdown. and the Salvadoran police reported a 54% reduction in extortion complaints from the start of 2022 until September 2022. Despite concerns, Bukele's harsh measures have proven the most effective crackdown in El Salvador's history. The question now is whether other gang-afflicted countries can adopt similar methods. In February 2023, Bukele ordered the transfer of 2,000 gang affiliates to a newly constructed mega prison. This prison, capable of holding 40,000 inmates, is located about 74 km southeast of the capital and consists of 8 buildings, each with 32 cells holding over 100 inmates. Worryingly, each cell is equipped with only 2 sinks and 1 toilet, suggesting a focus on containment rather than rehabilitation. Critics argue that such extreme conditions could negatively impact El Salvador's economy if these prisoners are ever released. However, Bukele has made it clear that he has no intention of letting them out. The crackdown under his administration has led to the incarceration of approximately 75,000 people, meaning about 1 in every 45 adults in the country is now behind bars. Bukele's methods have drawn attention from neighboring countries grappling with their own gang issues. Some leaders are considering adopting similar drastic measures, despite the inherent risks to democratic principles and human rights. However, the unique conditions that enabled Bukele's success in El Salvador are not easily replicable elsewhere. El Salvador's socio-political landscape, characterized by a history of intense violence and corruption, created a fertile ground for Bukele's authoritarian measures to take root. He capitalized on the public's exhaustion with crime and their yearning for security. Bukele's adept use of social media to communicate directly with the citizens further solidified his grip on power, bypassing traditional media outlets that he often accused of being biased or corrupt. Moreover, Bukele's economic initiatives, such as his controversial push to make Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador, have distracted international observers from the more contentious aspects of his security policies. This mix of economic innovation and draconian security measures has helped Bukele maintain high approval ratings despite criticisms from human rights organizations and foreign governments. The case of El Salvador under Bukele presents a complex scenario. On one hand, the streets are undeniably safer, and extortion rates have dropped, providing a sense of relief and normalcy to many Salvadorans. On the other hand, the severe repression of basic freedoms and the potential for long-term societal harm cannot be ignored. The mega prison, opened by Bukele, envisioned as a solution to El Salvador's gang problem, starkly illustrates his approach: overwhelming force and strict containment. While it remains to be seen whether this strategy will maintain long-term stability, the prison serves as a physical manifestation of Bukele's war on gangs, one that prioritizes immediate security over rehabilitation or systemic reform. For other countries looking to Bukele's model, several questions need to be addressed. Can they replicate El Salvador's specific conditions that facilitated his crackdown? Are they prepared to face the international backlash and potential alienation from global allies? Most importantly, how will they balance immediate security needs with the preservation of democratic values and human rights? Bukele's tenure as president has reshaped El Salvador in profound ways. His policies have sparked debates about the balance between security and freedom, the role of the media, and the use of state power. As he continues to govern, the world watches to see if his methods will achieve lasting peace or if they will eventually give rise to new forms of resistance and unrest. Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, has faced significant criticism from the United States, the European Union, and the Organization of American States, accused of deploying troops to intimidate members of Congress and firing Supreme Court magistrates to replace them with judges who permitted him to run and win a second term despite a constitutional ban. This foreign criticism has paradoxically unified many Salvadorans against a perceived common adversary, placing Bukele and his nation of 6.5 million people on the global map. Conversely, this attention comes at the cost of transforming El Salvador into a police state where soldiers and officers routinely whisk citizens off the streets, imprisoning them indefinitely without reason or legal access, with credible reports of torture and deaths among inmates. In 2022, inspired by Bukele's tactics, neighboring Honduras President Xiomara Castro launched a war against extortion, leading to decreased homicide rates, but failing to completely dismantle gang power. Southward, Ecuador grapples with a surge in gang violence, with some citizens yearning for a Bukele-like figure to restore order. Even in Chile, traditionally a stronger democracy and a safer country, there is growing sentiment for a leader who can emulate Bukele's tough stance on crime. However, those advocating for the replication of Bukele's model in other Latin American countries overlook the unique conditions that enabled its success in El Salvador. Salvadoran gangs, such as MS-13 and Barrio 18, were smaller scale and less formidable compared to powerful cartels in Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. Focusing on extortion rather than the broader drug trade, they were poorly financed and less armed. Once Bukele arrested key gang leaders, the gangs crumbled more easily than the more complex crime organizations in other countries. Applying Bukele's strategy to Latin America's wealthier, internationally connected, and better armed criminal groups seems impractical. For instance, Mexico's war on drugs, while yielding numerous arrests, did not significantly weaken the cartels due to their robust coordination and structure, with new criminal groups quickly filling the void left by arrested lords, driven by the drug trade's massive profits. Colombia's battle with Pablo Escobar's Medellín cartel in the 1980 SE and 1990 S mirrored this resilience, where government efforts faced strong backlash. Besides, El Salvador had more committed and professional security forces compared to its neighbors, enhancing Bukele's crackdown efforts, which is not mirrored in countries like Honduras, where gang-related corruption within security forces runs deep, thus undermining President Castro's attempts. Reports from Mexico and Venezuela indicate that criminal groups have successfully co-opted high-ranking military and police members, complicating any Bukele-style mass roundups. Furthermore, Bukele enjoys minimal political opposition, unlike countries with robust political parties and opposition forces that serve as checks on executive power. Other governments with more constraints on executive power are unlikely to enforce Bukele's extreme policies constitutionally. Despite Bukele's transformative crackdown, the gangs in El Salvador are far from eradicated. Official Salvadoran police data contradicts the government's narrative of total victory over gangs. By October 2023, Bukele's administration claimed to have arrested over 76,000 gang-related individuals, but real numbers indicated a significant portion were suspected collaborators or individuals under investigation, with 36% of gang members and collaborators still at large. Emulating Bukele's approach in other countries would likely replicate the negative aspects of El Salvador's model, such as civil unrest and increased violence, rather than its successes. Countries could face more resilient and powerful criminal groups fighting back with substantial firepower, shrinking civil society space, reducing government transparency, and overcrowding prisons. Historically, Latin American presidents with weak commitments to democracy might exploit crime fighting as a convenient pretext for political gain, using Bukele's model as justification. While Bukele's model has reduced crime rates in El Salvador, it comes at a stark cost. Leaders must consider if they are willing to bear this cost and the broader social ramifications, as the unique conditions enabling Bukele's success are not easily replicable elsewhere. Therefore, While Bukele's hardline approach has brought temporary gains, replicating it in countries with different socio-political landscapes is fraught with risks that could lead to further instability rather than the desired restoration of order. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth analyses and updates on global political dynamics. Your support helps us bring you more quality content. Stay informed and see you in the next piece.